So my name, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Sharon Carell, and I'm a volunteer with an organization called Citizens for Self-Governance. And we believe that the opportunity for self-governance is one of the great blessings that our American constitutional system provides for us. And so that's why we're taking this week, which is Constitution Week, to talk about the Constitution, because if we don't understand the principles behind our Constitution, then we're not going to be able to be very effective in operating within our system and acting in terms of self-governance. By the way, I work in writing systems technology, in case those of you who don't know who I am. So I used to work right in that room right there, but anyway. So an overview of the Constitution. Our Constitution is the longest surviving written national constitution. It's 232 years old yesterday. To compare, happy birthday, Constitution. To compare, the average length of a constitution is about 17 years. So you can see the difference. And when I say it's a written constitution, you may say, well, what constitution isn't written? Well, the United Kingdom has a constitution that they call their constitution. This basically consists of their body of case law that has never been formally written down in the same way that our constitution has been. So our constitution is about 4,500 words. It was written on 4 large sheets of paper that we'll see in a minute, sort of. And with the amendments, it's about 7,500 words. Now, one thing you have to keep in mind is the Constitution is one of 2 founding documents, and the other being the Declaration of Independence. So the Declaration lays out it isn't legally binding in the same way that the Constitution is, but it lays out some principles. And so that you need to read the Constitution and the ideas in the Constitution in light of the Declaration of Independence. So some of the principles that are written in the Constitution, in the Declaration of Independence, are the idea of laws being rooted in the laws of nature or nature's God. So they didn't believe that government and its operations should be arbitrary, but there's a sort of laws of nature that are behind them. The idea that all men are created equal, that there are inalienable rights, and so we see rights outlined in the Constitution that are reflective of these unalienable rights. That the purpose of government is the protection of rights. And there's a lot of disagreement in our society today about what is the purpose of government. It's a really fundamental question, but the founding fathers believed that the main purpose of government was the protection of our rights, of our inalienable rights, and that government derives its power from the consent of the governed, and that we have the right to alter or abolish the government if it doesn't protect our rights adequately. So these are some founding ideas behind the Constitution. So the Constitution, the precursor to the Constitution was the Articles of Confederation, which was ratified toward the end of the Revolutionary War in 1781, and was what was in effect during the early years of the American Republic. But it had a very weak central government. It required a supermajority to do anything. It required unanimity to make amendments. There was no ability to tax. There was no executive branch, and it just wasn't strong enough to really get these 13 states together in an effective way. So by the few years after the revolution was over, the economy of the United States was in a very bad state. There was debt. There were trade wars going along between the states, several of them. And so they said, we need to deal with they first wanted to deal with the trade wars because that was a problem. And they had this convention in Annapolis, but only 5 states showed up and they were going to deal with the trade wars. And they said, okay, we really need to deal with some problems here. We need to have a full convention that really addresses the problems that we're seeing. And so the states began to call for a convention to address these problems. And the language they used was that the goal was to render the Constitution of the national government adequate for the exigencies of the Union. So they wanted something that was going to be good enough to make it work, is basically what they were calling for. Now, there were some states that were dominated by anti-federalists who were very leery about a strong national government. And so they really wanted just to amend the Articles of Confederation. So there was a tension there. So the Constitutional Convention happened in Philadelphia. It started in May and went till September 17th, which was 232 years ago yesterday. They met behind closed doors because they wanted the freedom to freely discuss different kinds of ideas without there being rumors going around throughout the country about what they were doing. And as I mentioned, the Anti-Federalists were opposed to stronger federal power. And so there were a couple states who came whose commission said that they were there to amend the Articles of Confederation specifically. But there were people like James Madison and other people who had been studying philosophy and history and governments down through the ages, and they really felt like they had some ideas for a different kind of constitution. So they proposed we need a new kind of constitution that's similar in some ways to the Articles of Confederation, but organized differently. So several of the states left because they didn't feel like they had commissions that permitted them to create a new constitution. But the rest of there were 10 states who were involved in the whole convention, and they came up with a draft that was finished in September. It wasn't a foregone conclusion this was going to be ratified. There were several states that were opposed, partly due to the Anti-Federalist sentiment, and partly due to the lack of a Bill of Rights. There are several states that really wanted a Bill of Rights. And for this reason, these guys, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, wrote the Federalist Papers as sort of an explanation of their thinking behind the convention, the Constitution. And this is really useful for two reasons. One, it helped them get the Constitution ratified in the end, but also it's useful for us from a historical point of view because we understand very thoroughly what their thinking was and what their motivation was in the way they designed it. So there were several principles that were behind the Constitution. One is the idea of a republic. So we often talk about the United States being a democracy. But in fact, the founding fathers, they sometimes used the word democracy, but they were actually leery of the idea of a democracy, a pure democracy. They really felt that it would lead to something along the lines of mob rule. And so they set up a republican system that created a balance between the will of the majority and the rights of the minority. And that was something they were very careful to do. So you may have heard this quote, "Democracy is two wolves and a lamb voting on what to have for lunch. Liberty is a well-armed lamb contesting the vote." That's often attributed to Ben Franklin. We think he probably didn't say that. But what John Adams did say was, "Remember, democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There never was a democracy yet that did not commit suicide." So that was the first principle of underlying the Constitution. The second is the idea of separation of powers. Probably most of you learned this in school, I hope. And this is based on the axiom that most people are motivated by their own self-interest. And that means that people who get access to power, they want more power. So government is all about the exercise of power, and so therefore government unchecked will tend towards tyranny. And so they were very careful about putting limits on government. And this is a famous quote from James Madison that expresses this in Federalist 51. "If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls in government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place oblige it to control itself." So they were very concerned about giving the government just enough power, but not too much. And that's a tension that you see. So their idea was that if you create three branches of government with separate spheres of power, you'd have these power-hungry people in government because they knew they'd be there, and it would pit power against power, and so they would each control the other's power. And so we have the three branches of government: the legislative, executive, and judicial, with different powers and different authorities. And the third principle, and honestly, this is something I didn't really learn in school, is the principle of federalism. So from the point of view of the founders, the states were sovereign. They were sovereign entities. And in creating the United States of America, the states delegated a small part of their sovereign powers to the federal government to do certain kinds of things that they felt the federal government could do better than each individual state. And their theory was that government closer to the people is more amenable to the will of the people. And when you think about that, that makes sense, because the likelihood that you can contact the president of the United States or even your US senator and have any impact on them, that's pretty hard. But your city council, even your state representative, I could go to Austin, and I have, and met with people in the state senator's office or the state representative's office. So they wanted to keep as much power as possible close to the people. And so they set up these two different kinds of power: the federal powers, which were few and defined, and the state powers, which were numerous and indefinite. And so the federal government had the power to enforce the U.S. Constitution, and then there were 18 enumerated powers. The state had basically, well, they could ratify the constitutional amendments, so that gave them power over the Constitution ultimately. Originally, they had the power to appoint U.S. senators. Now, this has changed with the 17th Amendment, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. And then there's the 10th Amendment in the Constitution that says anything that's not enumerated goes to either the states or the people. So the idea that there was non-overlapping authority between the federal government and the states. Now, if you think about our government today, doesn't seem like it kind of works that way, does it? But that was the original design. So here's the 4 sheets of paper that the Constitution was originally written on. And you'll see there's 7 articles plus a preamble and 27 amendments. This doesn't show the amendments. And you'll notice the blue section. Let's see if I can do this. The blue section, oh, my mouse isn't working. The blue section and the green section, notice how much longer the blue section is than the others. And then the green section is quite long as well. And there's a reason for why these sections were longer. They're Articles 1 and 2. So let's first talk about the preamble. It starts out, "We the people of the United States," and that's probably the most famous part of the Constitution. What's interesting is the preamble, like the Declaration of Independence, it isn't legally binding in the same sense that the rest of the Constitution is, but it lays out sort of the ethos and the philosophy of the Constitution. It was written by this guy named Gouverneur Morris. Now, I used to wonder, what does Gouverneur mean? Was this like some fancy title? No, it's just his first name. I keep hoping he had a nickname. Nobody knows how to pronounce Gouverneur. But anyway, Gouverneur Morris was a delegate to the convention from Pennsylvania. And he wrote this language, but it's kind of actually accidental, because normally the preamble would list the states that were the sponsors of the document. But they weren't sure which states would be the first to ratify, so they didn't know which states to put in the preamble. And so Morris decided to say, "We the people of the United States." And he was actually argued with, like, that's kind of dumb. And they discussed it and felt like this is an appropriate way to start the document. And in the end, it became sort of iconic language that we're all very familiar with. So this little cartoon sort of reflects sort of the current understanding of the Constitution. Today we learned about the 3 equal branches of government: the executive, the media, and the lobbyists. Well, there's 2 problems with that. First of all, those aren't the 3 branches of government, and they weren't intended to be equal, as we'll see. So the first 3 articles of the Constitution discuss the 3 branches of government. The first being the legislative branch. And remember how long that was? The blue one is Article 1. And it was the longest because the framers of the Constitution thought that the legislative branch would be the strongest. They intended it to be the strongest. It was the rule of law, and they make the laws. And as we know, there are 2 houses, or what's the word? Can't remember the word. Chambers in the United States legislature: the House of Representatives and the Senate. And you may know, this may be familiar, but the House of Representatives is considered closer to the people. They're voted in more frequently, so they have to be responsive to the people, and they control taxation. And these ideas were borrowed from the English House of Commons. The Senate is smaller. They have longer terms. So each senator has more power. And they were considered by the framers, they were expected to be more mature and probably more conservative, but also more virtuous. They thought the senators would be more virtuous. Originally, as I said, senators were chosen by the states, which gave the states a direct representation in the federal government, but that has been changed. So the Article 1 lists the 18 enumerated powers. And I hope you can see some of these. So a lot of them have to do with money, coining money, taxing, borrowing money, punishing counterfeiting, post office, patents and copyrights, One thing they gave to the Congress was the power to raise and establish an army and a navy. And that was a little controversial because the founding fathers were leery about the idea of a standing army in the hands of the federal government. They were afraid that it could become oppressive, that the federal government could use it, sort of call it out against the people. And so they were nervous about that, but they did feel that it was necessary. So they included it. The last phrase says that Congress has the power to make all laws necessary and proper for the execution of the foregoing powers, or something like that. And notice that this is one of those phrases that can be a little bit elastic, like what laws are necessary and proper. I'd like to draw your attention to a couple specific clauses that are of interest. The spending clause says that there are two reasons for taxing and spending. One is to provide for the common defense, and one is for the general welfare of the United States. So general welfare, in the minds of the framers, what they meant by that was that they could tax and spend for national interests, not local or state interests. So that pretty much limited so you couldn't have the federal government give money for your bridge in your hometown or something like that. Now that was changed in 1936 with this court case, United States versus Butler. And notice this is the Depression. There's a lot of federal programs going on, and they decided that general welfare meant that really, they kind of redefined it to mean that the federal government can tax and spend for anything they think is a positive purpose. So that greatly increased the power of the federal government. Another clause that's similar is the Commerce Clause. So I mentioned that there were trade wars going on between the states, and the Commerce Clause was put in the Constitution to allow the Congress to regulate commerce among the several states. And in the minds of the framers, commerce meant the shipping or transport of goods across state lines. And so they wanted Congress to be able to control these trade wars that were going on. But this also was changed in 1942 by the Wickard v. Filburn case, which is a funny case that I can talk about if you're interested. But basically, it ended up giving the federal government control over the entire economy. Anything that affects the economy, they reinterpreted the word commerce to sort of mean anything that's economical. So, for example, did you see education listed in the enumerated powers? Yet today we have a Department of Education, right? And why is that? Because education is considered to affect commerce. In fact, almost everything affects commerce, right? Funny how that works. So Article 2 is about the executive branch, which is the president and his cabinet and his administrative agencies. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on the executive branch, but I didn't about the legislative branch either. But I'd like to highlight a couple things that are unique or distinctive about the Article 2. One is that it defines this electoral college that we're probably all familiar with. And the idea is that when we vote for our presidential candidate, we don't actually vote for him or her directly. We vote for an elector who will go to a big meeting and choose the president. And there were two reasons why they set up the electoral college. One reason was they were concerned that the populace as a whole wouldn't have good insight or good judgment about national candidates. And they thought having electors who were especially well educated and insightful would result in a better result. And today that's probably not the case because we have a lot of information about our national candidates. Maybe sometimes we have more information than we want to have about our national candidates. There's a second reason, though, why the Electoral College was put into place. They wanted to give slightly greater weight to the smaller states. And again, this is an example. There was always a concern about balancing the majority and the minority. And so while the Electoral College is proportioned along the lines of population, there's a slightly greater weight to the smaller states. And I think you could argue that this is still a valid reason to have the Electoral College today because it changes the way campaigning is done. It allows the smaller states to have some kind of reasonable say in the choosing of the president. So the laws concerning the way the Electoral College works has changed over the years. And so today there's a tighter link between the vote in the state and the candidates that's chosen. Another thing I'd like to talk about is impeachment. We're hearing a lot of talk about impeachment recently. So impeachment is allowed for treason, bribery, and high crimes and misdemeanors. And it applies not only to the president, but also the vice president, judges, legislators, civil officers. So the term high crimes and misdemeanors is an interesting one because it's not firmly defined. It doesn't necessarily apply only to actual criminal activity. I've heard a joke that you can actually impeach the president because he wears black shoes with a brown belt, if you want to. That's not really true. It can be criminal or non-criminal dereliction of duty, but it's intended to handle extreme cases of misuse of power or misuse of the office. And it's initiated by a vote in the House and then a trial in the Senate, which requires conviction. Conviction requires a 2/3 majority, which is a high bar. There have been 3 major impeachments in the history of the country. None of them have resulted in dismissal. But what's interesting is there were different levels of actual criminal offense in each one of these cases. Some had none, some had a little bit, and some had more. But there was political issues involved in all of these, why they ended up being impeached and why they were acquitted in the end. So Article 3 is about the judicial branch, and Article 3 actually isn't very long because the framers expected that the judicial branch would be the weakest of the 3 branches. And the reason why they said that was because the judicial branch doesn't control either the purse or the sword. It doesn't control money, and it doesn't control the military.
So just a thought I have there is just in leaving that shorter, they left fewer explicit constraints on the judicial branch and ended up actually.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. So the 9 justices that we have on the Supreme Court isn't actually specified in the Constitution. It was specified by the Judiciary Act of 1869. So when you think of different presidents who wanted to pack the court, Congress can put however many justices they want on the Supreme Court. So if a president can do that, they can do that. It's not really illegal. The thing to be aware of with regard to the judicial branch is the Marbury versus Madison decision of 1803. And it's probably one of the most significant decisions in the history of our country because it gave the Supreme Court the authority to perform judicial review. So they could decide that acts of Congress or acts of the president are unconstitutional. And so we can talk about that more at the end if we want to, but that gave quite a bit of power to the judicial branch. Not that it wasn't understood by the framers, they did understand the concept of judicial review. So it wasn't like that wasn't something they should have. But what it's done, it's created what we call the annotated Constitution. And this is a big book that has the entire Constitution plus all the case law applying to all the different clauses of the Constitution. It's about 300 pages. And this is the document that we are legally governed by. So when you hear, and the title of it is Constitution of the United States of America. That's the book. So when you compare that to our little, quite a difference, right?
300 or 3,000?
Sorry, 3,000, almost 3,000 pages.
Well, wouldn't that continually be growing?
And it's continually growing. So they print it with blank pages in the back of the book too, so they can keep adding because they know there's going to. So do we follow the Constitution? Sort of. We follow this mostly. So we've mentioned checks and balances, and so this just summarizes the checks and balances among the 3 branches of government. So the legislative branch has to approve the judges. So they have a check on the judicial branch. They can impeach executive officers. The executive branch can veto legislation, which is a check on the legislative branch. It can call special sessions of Congress, and he, the president, that is, and he nominates the judges. And the judicial branch has the power of judicial review. Article 4, defines the states and how they function in relation to each other and to the federal government. So the Article 4 defines that every state must be a republic. So that means popular rule, no monarch, so there's no state can set up a king, and the rule of law must be in order. Each state gets equal suffrage in the Senate, and that can't be just undone unless the state agrees. So that, again, that's the balance of power between the large states and the small states. There's also rules for creating new states or dividing states in two, like there's been talk about some states dividing themselves. That's happened, I think, once in history, maybe.
There's up there.
There's a chair here.
I think a division of a state has only happened once. And
Yeah, once.
Not entirely by the constitutional procedure.
Okay, well, there was a lot of things going on in the country at that point in history.
West
Virginia.
Splitting off from Virginia during the Civil War.
During the Civil War, yeah. So Article 5 is about amendment, the process of amendment. There have been 27 amendments in the history of our country. The first 10 are the Bill of Rights, as you may know. There are actually two processes for proposing amendments. And one, the normal one, the one we're familiar with, is that Congress can propose amendments with 2/3 of the House, of both houses. The other process is has having a convention of states. And this process has never been used. And what it involves is 2/3 of the states applying for a convention to propose amendments. There have been many applications for a convention of states to propose amendments under Article 5, but they've never aggregated to 34 states, which was 2/3 of the states. Some of them are very broad. Let's have a convention for proposing amendments. And some are real narrow, like we want this wording of this amendment to be proposed. But none of them have added up to 34. We've gotten really close a couple times. There are about 4 current efforts to call a convention of states. There's one that's been ongoing for a balanced budget amendment, a smaller effort for term limits. I think there's like 3 states that have signed on to that. Probably the most active right now is the Convention of States project. This is something I'm involved in, full disclosure. And it's about fiscal responsibility, term limits, and restricting the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. And there's about 15 states that are signed on to that one. Balanced budget has about 28 right now. There's a 4th effort that involves campaign finance reform, getting corporate money out of campaigns. Redefining persons so it doesn't include corporations is basically what that is. And there's like 4 states or something like that. So there's not only 2 processes for proposing amendments. Well, why do you think, let me just ask, why do you think there are 2 processes? Why do you think they wanted to include 2 processes? Checks and balances.
Partisanship, probably.
What do you think?
So that if Congress gets out of control, it can be reined in.
Yeah, that's pretty. They thought Congress would probably get out of control at some point, and they said if it gets out of control, they're not going to propose amendments to restrain if it becomes tyrannical. Congress is not going to propose amendments to restrain its own tyranny. So Ted Cruz keeps proposing these term limit amendments. Is it going to go anywhere? I don't think so personally, because Congress doesn't want term limits on itself. So there are both two processes for proposing amendments and 2 processes for ratification, and which is again a way of balancing power between the people and the state legislatures. The ratifying conventions thing has only been used once, and that was in the repeal of prohibition. Article 6 says that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Officers are bound by an oath to support it. It says a few other things. And finally, Article 7 is about the process of ratification. So it required 9 states, which is 3/4 of the states, to ratify in order for the Constitution to go into effect. Now, if you're thinking, if you're on your toes, you may think, wait a second. So they were governed by the Articles of Confederation, and that required unanimity to change the Constitution. So did they kind of pull a fast one here because they were going to put a new Constitution into effect, and they didn't use a unanimous process for that? So they kind of changed the rules, right? Well, not really, because what they did was in addition to the Constitution, they also provided a document that laid out the process for ratification. And they said that each state would call a ratification convention in their state. And in fact, also, and by doing that, by virtue of doing that, they would be sort of signing on to this new process. So all 13 states did call these ratification conventions. It took a while, and not all states did immediately ratify because of the different things we've mentioned, the Bill of Rights issue and the Anti-Federalist issue. But in the end, they got 9. In the end, they got 13. But New Hampshire became number 9 on June 21st, 1788. So it took about 9 months to get 9. Okay, moving on to the amendments. So the Bill of Rights consists of the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And this was important to many states only ratified the Constitution with the understanding and assumption that there was going to be a real Bill of Rights. So originally there were 12 amendments in the Bill of Rights, but only 10 were ratified in the end. And we'll look at one of those that's interesting. So it was ratified in 1791. So Amendment 1, I consider these sort of the rights of conscience, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, the press, the right of peaceable assembly, and the right to petition the government. I'd like to take a minute to talk about freedom of religion. So there are 2 clauses that discuss freedom of religion. Notice that the term separation of church and state isn't actually in here. What it says is Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Notice you also don't see the term freedom of worship. So freedom of worship has a little different meaning than free exercise of religion. Think about, so when you hear politicians use the term freedom of worship, think about what they're saying about that. So originally the Establishment Clause was saying that there could be no national church. That's what they were prohibiting. And it really didn't apply to the states because there were in fact states that had state churches originally. And they didn't, that was the national church. And then the free exercise clause said you can be part of any church you want, or, not any church at all if you don't want to. The founding fathers didn't see these 2 clauses as in any way contradictory or in tension. They thought they were 2 different ways of kind of saying the same thing. But what's happened in history over the last 200 years is because respecting an establishment of religion has been interpreted increasingly or seen as prohibiting any kind of religious philosophy to affect legal policy. And as that's increasingly become true, the establishment of religion, like they've been interpreting it as if you have any kind of religious foundation for some of your laws, that's establishment of religion. So increasingly, these 2 clauses are in tension. The establishment of religion can have the effect of keeping people from exercising their religion. And so today, these are seen as more in tension than they used to be. Could we save questions for the end? Sorry, because I do want to get through, and then hopefully we'll have some time. So remember that. Amendment 2, the right to bear arms. So it says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. What was this about? It wasn't about hunting. It wasn't about having a gun in your home to protect your home from invaders, although the founders did believe that that was a fundamental right. What this is about is they were concerned about the idea of a standing army being under the control of the federal government. And they were concerned that the army could become oppressive against the people. And so they wanted to allow that, but they included the Second Amendment as a reassurance that an armed populace would always be present to balance the power of the army under the control of a potentially tyrannical central government. And so they wanted to balance the people against the army. Now, today, people don't worry that much about the army becoming oppressive against the people because we haven't had it happen in our history. Of course, it's happened in other places, but people aren't worried about that. And so Second Amendment has become controversial. And you'll notice you'll hear politicians sometimes say, well, people can have arms, but just not military grade arms. Well, think about what the founders' intention was. They intended for people to have military grade arms. So think about that. Anyway. The Third Amendment was about the quartering of soldiers in people's private homes. Not an issue today, but it was a big deal at the time of the Revolution because this was one of the main beefs that that the colonists had with the British government. Amendment 4 is protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. So the government just can't come in, read your computer, take your stuff, your paperwork out of your house. They can't listen in on your phone calls without a warrant or and probable cause.
They let Alexa do that.
Yeah, amendments 5 to 8 are about various criminal processes. There's the right, the right to not be forced to testify against yourself, the right to remain silent, which we call taking the fifth because it's in the Fifth Amendment, and some of these other fundamental rights, trials, bail, cruel and unusual punishment, and so forth. Amendment 9 is probably not as familiar. I don't know, it wasn't familiar to me until I started studying this. It says the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights should not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. So remember that there was concern about having a Bill of Rights because people were concerned about this principle that if you list them all out, the assumption is that's all there are. And they wanted to make it clear that they knew there could be other rights that they hadn't covered. And so they put the Ninth Amendment in here. And finally, the 10th Amendment of the Bill of Rights, not the final amendment, but says the power is not delegated to the states by the Constitution, nor but to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, or reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. So basically, it's saying the federal government gets what's in the Constitution and it doesn't get anything else. Everything else goes to the states or to the people. Now, as we've talked about, federal government and federal power has grown significantly over 200 years. So what do the states do if the federal government encroaches on their rights? Can they sue? Can they pass a resolution saying we're not going to do that? Well, some of these things have been tried, not with very much success. And my personal opinion that this is kind of one of the holes in the Constitution. They didn't define a process for enforcing the 10th Amendment. Maybe if they had, we'd have better balance of power today. Amendments 11 and 12 are boring and technical. I'm going to skip them. Maybe some of you find them interesting, but I found out recently, learned something interesting about the 11th Amendment, but it's very technical. Amendments 13 to 15 are the post-Civil War amendments. So they abolish slavery. They talk about the rights of citizens because the idea of the newly freed slaves were to be considered citizens with the rights of due process. Other things left over from cleaning up things from after the Civil War. Voting rights for the former slaves. Now, something interesting happened after these amendments were passed in the latter part of the 19th century. Originally, the Bill of Rights was only applied to the federal government as part of the U.S. Constitution. And the states could have their own Bill of Rights or not as they chose. So at the latter part of the 19th century, they started applying the Bill of Rights to the states. And they used the term incorporation against the states. So today, not only can the federal government not violate your right to free speech, but the state of Texas can't do that either, whether or not it's in the Texas state constitution. Now, not all of the Bill of Rights is treated this way so far, but it sort of has changed the balance of power between the federal government and the states. And of course, why were they doing that? Because they'd come right off the Civil War. There was a sense that some of the states had abused people's rights, probably. I'm assuming that was part of the motivation for this interpretation. I shouldn't assume, but I would guess. So in the early 20th century, we had some new amendments. The 16th Amendment gives the federal government the right to impose an income tax on us. It was only going to be 1%, you know. That's what they said. It'd just be 1%, maybe 2%. And the 17th Amendment changed the election of senators to be from being selected by the state legislatures to being selected by the people, popular vote. So what do you think this did to the balance of power between the federal government and the states?
Gave the federal government more power.
Gave the federal government more power because no longer do the states have direct representation in in Congress, and the federal government can tax us. So yeah, affected the balance of power again. And there's some other amendments there: prohibition, women's suffrage, moving forward the date of the inauguration because they felt there was too long a lame duck session, got too long. And with travel and communication, it was easier to make it earlier. Of course, now the inauguration is outside in January, which is not necessarily a good idea. Repeal prohibition. And finally, the recent amendments. I think these are interesting because they're all mostly related to current events at the time that the amendments were enacted. So what had just happened in 1947? World War II. What else? FDR had been president, and he had 4 terms. And there had been a tradition among presidents that started by George Washington that you only have 2 terms. Well, FDR didn't go along with the tradition, so they decided to enact the tradition in the Constitution. They added electoral college votes for DC. Has anybody been to Washington? Do you know what they have on their license plates? Do you know what it says?
Something about that, representation.
Yeah, it says District of Columbia, taxation without representation. They still don't have anybody in Congress.
That'll change, I think.
Could be. 1964, what was happening in 1964 that related to poll taxes? Civil rights. So they found poll taxes to be problematic for civil rights. 1965, what had happened? Okay. So what had happened a few years before was the assassination of Kennedy, and they started thinking about what would have happened if he wasn't actually killed, but he was just disabled or in a coma. Do we have a good process for transferring power from the president to the vice president? And there's some concerns about the 25th Amendment because some people said this could be used to have a coup. Could that happen? I don't know. But just keep. So when you have a president who's not functioning, he's doing his job and he's not functioning. You feel like he's been abusing his power or he's not carrying out his responsibilities well. What do? You impeach. You don't use the 25th Amendment. That's in my opinion, that's very abusive. Okay. 26th Amendment. What was happening in 1971? Kent State and Vietnam War. So you had these young guys, 18, 19-year-olds going off to war, an unpopular war. They were drafted, and they didn't even have a vote. So it was felt that if the guys can go, they can be drafted and fight in a war, they ought to be able to vote about it. 1972 was the last amendment to the Constitution. 1992, sorry, yeah, 1992. And what this says is that when Congress votes itself a raise, they have to stand for re-election before the raise goes into effect, which kind of makes sense, right? Now, this was actually proposed as part of the Bill of Rights and never got ratified. And there was this young guy who was in college, and he was studying this, and he wrote a paper on this for a college class, and he said, I think this has been proposed formally, and we could still do this. We could ratify this, and I read that he got a C on the paper. So, so he said, I'm going to show that teacher, and he created a one-man campaign to get this ratified, and he did in 1992.
One interesting thing about the 27th is it was actually the first article.
Yeah, I think you're right.
So
about that.
had it been ratified at the time, it would have been the First Amendment.
Yes. Okay, that's right. I think that's right.
How did it get ratified? I don't understand what this one guy did.
He just went around the state legislatures and got.
And enough people were concerned with the congressional pay raises that it took off.
So eventually Congress did vote.
No, but Congress had already proposed it. See, Congress would probably have never proposed it in 1985 or whenever that was. It was already formally proposed, so the states could ratify it.
38 states ratified.
So it was the state legislatures that ratified it.
Which university, do you know?
He was in Texas. I don't know.
Was it Texas?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
I'd be like, A&M.
Thank you, Austin.
Austin?
Austin.
Okay. So I'd like to say a few words about constitutional interpretation. So there's a couple different philosophies about constitutional interpretation. One is what we might call the originalist interpretation, which says that the meaning of the Constitution ought to stay as close as possible to the understanding of the framers or the legislatures that enacted any amendments. And so if you want to amend the Constitution, you need to use Article 5, which is kind of hard, which means that you can call the originalist approach the conservative approach, because it sort of imposes a slow process of change on the Constitution. The other approach, and I'm sure there's some that are in between, but the other approach is what we might call the positivist approach, or some people call it the living document approach. Eric Metaxas calls it the Rorschach blot Constitution. Like you can just find anything you want in it. So, and that says that the Supreme Court has the liberty to give new meanings to old language, to adjust principles, incorporate principles that maybe weren't present at the time that the law, the Constitution, the section of the Constitution went into effect. And what that essentially means is that amendment can occur by the Supreme Court because they can vastly reinterpret certain clauses of the Constitution in a significant way. So you can call this the liberal or progressive approach, because it means the meaning, the change, the speed of change, the rate of change of the meaning is much faster. So an example of that is the Commerce Clause. Does it mean transport of goods across state lines, or does it mean anything related to the economy? So as we think about these two approaches, you might want to ask yourself, which approach is most consistent with the principle of the consent of the governed? And the fact is that when you use the positivist approach, it's very easy for the Supreme Court to, in effect, amend the Constitution in a way that would never be possible using legislation. And they've actually done that several times in history. I'd like to close with a story. This is from a book by Eric Metaxas called If You Can Keep It, Forgotten Promise of American Liberty. Dr. James McHenry, a delegate from Maryland, was at age 34, one of the youngest men at the Constitutional Convention. As things were breaking up at the end of the last day, McHenry was privileged to witness a historic exchange. He writes that when Benjamin Franklin emerged from the building that day, he was accosted by a certain Mrs. Powell of Philadelphia. Franklin was then 81 years old, the oldest delegate, who for his part in those hallowed proceedings came to be known as the Sage of the Constitution. According to McHenry, Mrs. Powell put a question to Franklin directly. "Well, doctor," she asked him, "what have we got? A republic or a monarchy?" Franklin, who was rarely short of words or wit, shot back, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." What Franklin meant was that whatever document they ended up with, and whatever government it described and created, it would only be a beginning. The people themselves would have to do a lot to make it work. A government in which the people would govern themselves would be fragile. It would require the people's attention in a way that no other government would. It would be, in the famous phrase, "We the people, who must keep the republic." What the Constitution promised would require the efforts of all those who henceforth called themselves Americans. It was they who must keep it, the republic and the grand and noble promise of that republic. That is the wonderful, spectacular genius of it all, and the terrible, sobering danger of it all, too. The document and the men who created it put these unimaginably great and fragile things in the hands of the people. So these things, still unimaginably great and fragile, are in our hands now, this minute. We are ourselves, this moment, the keepers of the flame of liberty, and the ones charged by Franklin and the other founders, and by history, past, present, and future, with the keeping of this great promise to the world. So I think we have a few minutes for questions. There's some resources listed up there, or any of the items that you didn't get the answers to, we can fill in. Yes, Jim?
Okay, I have two comments.
Uh-huh.
First of all, I think the genius of the Constitution is in the recognition of the need to limit power in order to sustain a democracy. And there are a lot of people a lot of times we think all you need to have democracy is elections. There've been a lot of elections in the world where they've been held one time and ending up in tyranny. And But what you really need for democracy is limited power, and the Constitution provides that. The other thing I wanted to comment on earlier was the First Amendment.
First Amendment.
The two primary clauses of the First Amendment on freedom of religion and freedom of speech. And it seems like people almost treat those as two separate things.
Right, they're very
But I think they're in the
close.
same amendment for a reason.
Yeah,
You
absolutely.
don't really have freedom to believe what you want to believe if you don't have a freedom to express it.
Mhm.
And you don't really have a freedom to say anything if you don't have a freedom to hold on to what you believe.
Mhm.
So the two are inseparable.
They're two sides of the same coin, absolutely.
Two sides of the same thing. And generally, in recent years, there's been a tendency to restrict freedom of religion because of fear about violating someone else's rights and so on. But the real solution is not less speech, it's more speech.
I saw that video and I thought, this can't be true. They went on the Yale University campus and they had a petition there to repeal the First Amendment. And they had 50% of the people on the campus of Yale signed it. And I thought, this can't be right now. They confutz with wording and people must have, I thought these are Yale students or faculty, they ought to be pretty smart. And so I wrote to a guy, our Facebook friend, and asked, because he works at Yale, and I don't know him very well, and I tried to word this very neutrally, and I said, do you think this is really reflective of the mindset at Yale? And from what he wrote back, he said, yeah, that's kind of the mindset. He goes, I think you could make an argument for the First Amendment. I was like, yeah, you sure could. So, they don't,
Yeah, there's a very similar to what you said here, but there's a legal scholar who studied this a lot, and in his book he argues that originally the Establishment Clause is to serve free exercise clause. In other words, coming out of England,
yes.
the established Church of England kept them from freely exercising religion, but the courts gradually, one decision after another, have reversed it so that the free exercise clause now serves the Establishment Clause. And so, as you said, anybody who
That's a good way of thinking.
exercises any sort of religious involvement, like if the government funds a church project, that would be allowed. That would be establishment. The national church, essentially. So they've never really been. You can view them as two sides of the same coin, but really it's one's supposed to serve the other, and now that's flipped. And so.
Any other comments? I want to ask you a question real quick. How many of you were taught at some point in your lives that the Constitutional Convention was a runaway convention and that they really went outside of their bounds of authority when they created a new constitution instead of amending the Articles of Confederation? Was anybody taught that? You had taught that? Were you taught it in school? Or
I'm not sure if I was taught it.
okay, I was never taught that, but it seems to be a common.
I think I was taught that the accusation was made.
Yes,
I don't
and the
think
accusation was made.
I
Okay,
don't think I was taught that it was.
Okay.
I'm more ignorant than the rest of you, or I've forgotten more. I actually had, it's been a long time since I've been in school, forgotten that there was such a gap of time between the start of the Union and the
right. It's
ratification of the Constitution. So if there was no CEO identified in the Articles of Confederation,
Could they do anything?
upon what did the presidents govern?
Well,
If they were based on.
There wasn't any president. There was no president. So there was a Congress. There was like a congressional legislative body, but there wasn't any executive branch at all.
Effectively, the United States was a union of independent countries that was actually, from what I've generally heard, looser than the EU is now.
What year was Washington inaugurated? 89? 90?
Well, the Constitution went into effect in '89, but I thought,
He was elected in '88.
yeah, which seems,
Inaugurated in '89.
yeah, I think that's right, and it surprises me that they would have had an election in '88 if they. Oh no, it was '88. '88 was when they. So it was '88 that they ratified. So they probably had the election in the fall, and then he took office in the spring, right around the time that they said the Constitution was going to go into effect, 1989, 1789.
You said it was 232 years.
Yeah, 87 was when they finished the drafting.
Ah.
87 is when they finished the drafting. 89 is when it officially completely went into effect, and 88 was when they finished ratifying the 9 states. Anybody can leave if you need to, and just quarter after, and thank you.
Were any of the Bill of Rights included in the original Articles of Confederation?
I don't think they had a Bill of Rights. I know that, so the Virginia, I know that Virginia, some of the states had them, and Virginia had a Bill of Rights that was sort of a model for the National Bill of Rights. So George Mason was, when I was in Williamsburg, he was there with his, they have these interpreters, historical interpreters, and yeah, he looks very good for his age. And he was carrying around this copy of this Bill of Rights that he had written. So, yeah.
One other question. In those back to that early period again, you mentioned there were a number of states that were anti-federalist.
Mm-hmm.
If they were anti-federalist, they were pro what?
They wanted something along the lines of the Articles of Confederation that kept the states very independent and a very weak federal. They wanted a federal government, but something very weak.
Okay.
So they were leery of adding more.
I think they were the bigger states.
We need to put ourselves into the world of that time. There wasn't any models.
Right. This was brand
The
new.
whole idea that there would be a country made up of states and people cooperating together without having somebody who was absolutely in authority was unimaginable. And they imagined it all over fresh for the first time. The fact that there would be these problems might come up. Some of those problems probably came up during the Articles of Confederation,
Mm-hmm.
and the Continental Congress, had issues that people began to realize. Well, this could come up and that could come up. We have to fix for this. We have to fix for that. They were thinking it all through. And what makes it a remarkable document is not that everything was thought through, but that so much was thought through.
Mm-hmm.
But it's still that world. It was a world in which the word state meant country, and it still mostly does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in most parts of the world.
And so they didn't see themselves, it wasn't finally settled that there would be such a thing as one country made up of units inside of it until after the Civil War.
Yeah, the Civil War changed the understanding of the relationship of the states as well. Yeah.
Like Europe, they call us the country without a name.
The United States of America, right?
What's the name of your country?
So, John, in Australia, is the federal system in Australia similar to the United States, or is it more tightly controlled? Are the states less independent than they are here? Okay.
Australian Constitution is actually an act of the British
Okay.
Parliament.
Okay, I didn't know that. I have copies of the Constitution, if anyone would like them.
The Constitution.
And
It's written, doesn't it?
I mentioned the Convention of States project that I'm part of. So I have some of these if anybody's interested in finding out what that's about. I have about 10, so if anybody's interested. Sort of describes the goal of limiting the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. And so thank you all for coming. I want to say one more thing. I'm also, in addition to being involved in Citizens for Self-Governance and Convention of States, I'm also involved with the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. And so I'm hoping that in a few months, maybe next spring, I'd like to do a series on Christian worldview, and I have some material laid out for that. So just keep that in mind and come back for that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming.